Thank you for coming tonight. Welcome to New Bedford if you're not from here. And this is going to be our fourth version of what we call the VIP tour, which is highlighting not just the properties, but the people that lived at the properties, some of the most distinguished citizens in New Bedford. And so that's the theme of tonight's tour. We're going to 7 different properties. We're going to be passing a lot of houses that are very attractive that I'm not going to talk about. If you have any questions about those properties as we go by, just talk to me when we're walking from property to property. What my style is to walk to a property, talk about it, and then we walk to the next property. So if you have any questions about what you see in between, just be free to ask. Now the house we're talking about here is 350 Union, right across the street. And the plaque says Hosea Knowlton. He's actually the next man on the list that we're going to talk about tonight. But another man who lived in this house in the teens, his name was Charles O. Dexter. Charles Owen Dexter. And he lived in this beautiful house, which was built around 1850. Like I said, from like 1912 to 1920. And there's 2 parts to this story, actually. Dexter was born in 1862. He and his cousin, Charles Owen, they were partners in a textile mill in New Bedford. It was the most unique mill that was built here, that was operated here in the Beacon Mill. Most of the mills that were let's go talk about the mill first, and we'll talk about Dexter afterwards. The Beacon Mill, I wanted to tell the story for a long time because the Beacon Mill is a very interesting story. The Beacon Mill, which was formed in 1904, to get an idea where it is, the last remnant of the Beacon Mill is the Sid Wainer building on Nauset County Street. That's the last remnant of the Beacon Mill, is the Sid Wainer building. The textile industry in New Bedford was very, very similar in every respect. Every mill basically did the same thing. They made thread and they made cloth. There was no finishing. This is not the apparel industry now. This is the textile industry. There was no finishing done in New Bedford. They made hundreds and thousands of yards of cloth and so many spools of thread and farmed it out to other places. That was 99.9% of the mills. The Beacon Mill, on the other hand, was not that model. The Beacon Mill was only a weaving mill, and they bought finished thread and wove their own blankets. They were famous for the Beacon blanket. The Beacon blanket was their trademark. Now, they made other things as well, but they made and labeled, trademarked their Beacon blankets, made them here. They had the Sid Wainer building, if you're familiar with that, was a warehouse building. It wasn't anything but a warehouse building. And there were 5 or 6 of them in a line that was the first one, and there was 5 or 6 in a line that went west, if you're familiar with the site. The rest of 13 acres was weave shed. All they did was weave, and they weaved these finished blankets. They labeled them made in New Bedford. They warehoused them in these big warehouses that were on site. And they sold them and marketed them from that and distributed them to retailers from there. They weren't farmed out to other places. They were their own retailer and distributor. There was no other mill that was doing that, none. Wamsutter got involved in that later on a little bit with their sheets and pillowcases. They started to brand their own things. They hadn't done that for years. They didn't even start doing it until the 20s, actually the 1920s. And they were in business since the 1840s. But the Beacon Mill right out of the box was making their own finished products here, mostly blankets. They did lots of other things. If you look in eBay once in a while, you'll find a silk robe from Beacon. And it has the label, made in New Bedford. That was their business. They did a fabulous job. They had 13 acres of weave sheds over in that spot where to the north of where the Sid Wainer building is now. There's a car wash now there. There's even a street in the back end of the property called Beacon Street, because that's where the mill was. Now the mill was very successful, but they decided, like lots of the mills were thinking about, they decided they were going to build a satellite plant in North Carolina, western North Carolina, not far from Asheville, North Carolina. In 1925, they built a plant there. And after the strike of 1928, the Beacon Mill was one of the only mills that actually didn't go out on strike because their business model was different and their wage scale was different. So they didn't go on strike in 1928, but it still affected business overall. And so in the early days of the Great Depression, nobody was making money, and the Beacon Mill decided that they would move their entire operation in the early 1930s to this location in western North Carolina. Over a period of 2 or 3 years, they shipped every piece of machinery from the mill here. It had to be hundreds of pieces of machinery. I think they had 2,000 looms to North Carolina. They asked people, the workers, if they wanted to transfer to North Carolina. They even took bricks and remnants of the mills that had been dismantled and shipped them to North Carolina. And the Beacon Mill was successful, continued to make these blankets until it didn't go out of business until 2000, actually, the year 2000. The Beacon blanket. Look it up on eBay. They have a whole book about the Beacon blanket. It's like a collector's book.
Was it still a Beacon Mill when it went to North Carolina?
Yes, it was still called Beacon Mill. Yep. Now, when I was doing my research on the mills, I got a call from one of my friends, and she said, "There's a Beacon blanket for sale in the Standard Times today, $25." So I called the guy and I said, can I look at your blanket? I'm interested in buying it. And so I went over there, and it was a completely unused blanket. It had a paper label the size of a large postcard, which was slightly stitched into one of the corners of the blanket. It said "Made in New Bedford." It had a picture of them, an etching like of the mill site on this card. $25. I bought it actually to give to a museum because I figured it hadn't even been unfolded. It was in a plastic bed. A lot of the Beacon blankets, they were known for Indian and Navajo-like designs. But this blanket was more like an Art Deco. There'll be a picture of it on the video if you have time to look at the video. There's a picture of this blanket. And I bought it really to give to a museum. I thought I could give it to one of the New Bedford museums, but nobody wanted it in New Bedford. But this is the next part of the story. Charles O. Dexter, he was one of the mill owners and a manager at the mill as well. And when he was 59 in 1920, his doctor told him that he had a bad heart and he didn't have long to live. So Dexter decided to retire and buy a big farm in Sandwich, Mass. A 500-acre farm in Sandwich, Mass. And he retired out there. He hired a very famous landscaper to develop his site, and he became a famous hybrid developer of rhododendrons. He became famous for developing rhododendrons at this site. Well, to make a long story short, his farm is now the Heritage Museum in Sandwich. He died in 1943, lived 20 years longer than the doctor thought he was going to, and died, and he left this huge legacy of this beautiful place with all these rhododendrons. The Eli Lilly Company bought the house after that. They're the ones that, if you've been to the Heritage Plantation, they have a car collection, an antique car collection. That came from the Lilly family. And then it became a separate museum. I think Heritage Plantation, it's called the Heritage Gardens now. It was about 1970 or so that it was opened. Anyway, interesting story. So when no one wanted the blanket, I contacted the Heritage Plantation and said, "I got a Beacon blanket. Do you want?" The lady called me like 5 minutes later, says, "I want that blanket." Who was the curator of the collections. So you can see a picture actually in their collections illustrations at the Heritage Museum, a picture of the blanket as well. So that's a story on Dexter. He and his partner really had created a great business model Owen, Dexter never went to North Carolina. He retired, stayed here. But Owen went to North Carolina, continued to run the mill. His son was named Charles Owen as well. He continued to run the mill almost through the end of its run, and it was a very successful company. There's lots of articles about Beacon Blankets, the Beacon Company, because of the blankets it was very collectible in its day, and it's still collectible today if you can find them, because they're not made anymore, and ones with big paper labels with "Made in New Bedford" on it are very rare. So. This is the Ash Street Jail, still in operation. I'm not sure if it's the oldest continually operated jail in the country, but it's pretty close. This part of the jail was built in 1888. And the person that I want to talk about here is a man by the name of Hosea Knowlton. He's actually the man that has got the plaque for the house we were just at. He lived in that house during his lifetime. But Knowlton was an interesting man. He wasn't born in New Bedford, but he came to New Bedford as a young man. He was a lawyer, did all the things that educated people, went to boarding school, went to Harvard Law, got his degrees. He was very ambitious. He was in the state legislature, and he became district attorney for this district in around 1890. So when the Borden murders took place in 1892, he did the preliminary investigation and questioning of Lizzie, but he didn't really want the job. He could see right off the bat, after the initial go through of the evidence and talking to her and so forth, that this was going to be a tough case to win, because there was no evidence. I mean, the only evidence is, how could it not be Lizzie? He was in the house when the murders took place, But nonetheless, he didn't think it was a winnable case. So he tried to beg off the job. He went to the Attorney General and said, I don't think I can win this. Can you assign somebody else to the job? And the Attorney General said, no, you got to take the job. So he did. And everybody kind of agrees that Hosea did a very good job in the prosecution of the case. But there was no shot that he was going to win, and he didn't win. The case really, other than the fact that Lizzie was in the house, there was no evidence. He managed to deny everything, and so forth. So she was acquitted, and Knowlton didn't win the case. But nonetheless, he got a lot of publicity for being in the case and being on the trial, and his name was well known. And he ran against the Attorney General, who had denied him his request not to do the case, and he beat him. So Knowlton got some payback by running against his guy's name was Albert Pillsbury, and running against him in the 1894 election for Attorney General, and he won. And he had that job for the rest of his life, which wasn't very long, unfortunately. He was born in 1847, and he had a stroke at his vacation house in Marion in 1902 and died. But Knowlton was a very important man during his day, and I wanted to talk about him here at this site. Now, the last person on tonight's tour is a woman who wrote a memoir, and one of her memories was that she was told when she was a young person that the medical examiner, or the doctor who was assigned in the Borden case to examine Lizzie, to do a physical exam of Lizzie, stayed at their house in New Bedford during the trial. And this doctor told these people that Lizzie had the muscles of a gravedigger. She was extremely strong physically, which I think lends credence to the fact that she was certainly able to inflict the wounds on people that were inflicted that day. That's not to say that she's guilty. She was acquitted. That's the way the things work. But nonetheless, the circumstantial evidence against Lizzie is pretty strong. This house here was owned by an important woman in New Bedford in recent times. Her name was Rosalind Poll Brooker. And I've done this VIP, this is the fourth time I've done the VIP tour, and I've done a lot of people. This is the only person I actually met in my life. She would never have remembered me, but I met her, and I always wanted to come down here and talk about her because she was a very interesting lady. Mrs. Brooker was born in Fall River, but came to New Bedford as a young woman, and went to New Bedford High School and Boston University, got a law degree. She's got a lot of firsts in New Bedford. First woman city councilor, first woman city council president, first woman city solicitor. And, you know, you can read about her. She's one of the ladies that's in the Whaling Museum's Lighting the Way articles. Rosalind Poll Brooker. But I knew her because this is how I met Mrs. Brooker. The library, I worked in the library downtown. If everybody's familiar with the library downtown here in New Bedford, the third floor has a meeting room on the east side of the building. On the west side, on the north side of the building, rather, the south side of the building is the meeting room. The north side of the building is the art room now. But when I worked there in the early 70s, it was called the genealogy room. It's the local history room. And it was a busy place because, you know, before the internet, you know, you had to actually look stuff up in books and whatnot. And we had a lot of the resources that a lot of people didn't have, and from all over the Bristol County. And so it was a busy place. But in the meeting room across the hall, they had something on I don't know if it was monthly or every 2 weeks, every 6 weeks. I'm not sure when it was. They had the Industrial Accident Board met in the early 70s. Now, in the early 70s in New Bedford, there was still a lot of manufacturing. You had all the dress shops. You had the tire company, the Goodyear Tire in the South End. You had all the electronic components places, Aerovox and Cornell, and you had all kinds of places. You had Morse Twist Drill was still in operation. So you had a lot of manufacturing going on in New Bedford at the time. None of that hardly exists anymore except Joseph Abboud. But there was a lot of manufacturing in New Bedford. So there were a lot of accidents. It was a big deal, this accidents board, because the head of the hearing officer had the power to grant workman's comp and not workman's comp. So Mrs. Brooker was appointed what they called an administrative judge. So she was one of the persons who was a judge that came into to preside over this, what was really kind of chaotic a lot of the times. You had all kinds of people in the third floor there. So let me try to show you what happened normally. When the industrial actions boards came, you could tell. All of a sudden, the place was crowded with lawyers. They just came into the genealogy room, didn't care where they sat, didn't care how loud they talked, didn't care about anything really, except the fact that they had a suit next door. There were clients everywhere. It was just a zoo, really. And sometimes the hearings were a zoo as well. But not when Mrs. Brooker was the hearing officer. Because Mrs. Brooker was this very, very slight woman. Very slight. Couldn't have been more than 5 foot tall. Skinny as a rail. And she had polio on top of that. But when she came to do the hearings, there was law and order in the chaos of the industrial accident board. She was good like that. The first time I should say, Mrs. Brooker had polio. And there was a little, if you're familiar with the library, I'm not even sure if that elevator is there anymore, but in the front of the building, there was an elevator, a small elevator shaft, like a one-person elevator shaft. And she would have to take the elevator up. As soon as she got out of the elevator, I knew it was Mrs. Brooker because she was like a robot from a sci-fi movie. All her braces were squeaking, and she would be walking as fast as she could. Not very fast, but she was going as fast as she could. You could hear all the braces going because she had braces all over her body. And she had braces on her arms so she could walk, like to hold herself up and stuff. When you read the article in the Lighting the Way, it talks about she had bouts of polio. Yeah, she really had bouts of polio because she could barely move, really. But that didn't stop her. And you got to realize that the lawyers that were coming in to these accident hearings were some of the biggest names in New Bedford. Edward Harrington, Edmund Denise, John Eckfeldt, these people who are used to getting their own ways. Edmund Denise was a district attorney for the state. He was the one who was involved in the infamous Chappaquiddick incident. And Denise was very, very popular. I mean, lawyers flocked to him. John Eckfeldt is a judge now, big guy, very intimidating. And Edward Harrington was one of the top criminal lawyers in New Bedford, and he was also a former mayor. So these were people who were tough, to handle. But Mrs. Brooker had no problems with them. And she was, and how I met her is when most of the industrial accident hearing officers, they didn't bother with me at all. They didn't look at me if they even came in. When Mrs. Brooker came in, introduced herself, even on the first time, I had just a desk, I didn't have an office, I had a desk in this room. And I had a pole to hang my coat up. And first time Mrs. Brooker came in, she gave me her coat and told me to put it on the pole. I had to take my coat off and put it on the floor. So every time I could hear those squeaking, when she came out of the elevator, I heard those squeaking braces. I took my coat off and put it on the ground because I knew I was going to get Mrs. Brooker's coat. But she was very nice. She was kind to me. She always stopped and talked and asked me how I was doing, what was going on. And because of that, I never forgot her, really. And I always hoped that we could get down to the site at some point and talk about her because she was a really, really great lady. She retired around 1990 from New Bedford, the various jobs that she had, moved to Florida, but she is buried in the Jewish cemetery that's beyond the airport. There's a Jewish cemetery beyond the airport, Plainville Road there. She's buried there, so she did come back home. But anyway, she was a lovely lady in her own way, and I appreciated the kindness when it was rare during those industrial accident hearings. This is the house she lived in all the time that she lived in New Bedford. It's a three-family now. I don't know if it was a three-family when she lived in it or not. I suspect it wasn't, but it could have been. House dates from 1880. It's a nice house, kind of squeezed into this neighborhood. But anyway, this was her residence for the time that she lived in New Bedford. This site is two parts to the story. First is about a woman by the name of Harriet Pickering. Harriet Pickering was a weaver in the mills of New Bedford. She was born in 1865 in Lancashire, England, in a town called Blackburn. Now, if you have relatives that worked in the mills and were from England, they came from Lancashire, almost certainly. Almost all of the English immigrants to the mills, they were recruited heavily because they were weavers. And weavers, before the automatic loom, were a very, very hard commodity to find. They got paid well, relatively speaking, and there was good jobs here for them, but there wasn't a lot of them. So a lot of immigrants from that district of England came here to work as weavers in the mills. Now Lancashire is that section of England which is in the northwest corner of the country, between Liverpool, which is one of the towns in Lancashire, and Manchester is the other major city in Lancashire, and all that area in the northwest point, not doesn't extend all the way to Scotland, but that area that's right on the Irish Sea. Matter of fact, my own parents on the Barn side are from Blackpool, which is another Lancashire town. Anyway, Harriet was born in 1865. She was born to a farming family, actually, according to the little information we have about her. But she didn't want to work on the farm, started working in the mills at 8 years old. 8 years old. And by the time she was 18, she got married to a mule spinner, probably in the United States. She was probably in the United States when she got married. She had a son when she was 20, and her husband died. So she was a single woman who was trying to raise a kid without the help of the mills as much as possible. She did not want to live in mill housing. She lived in a lot of places during the 5 or 6 years, about 10 years that she lived in New Bedford. And one of those houses was right on this empty lot, 81 Ash Street. It was probably a rooming house, like one of these big places right here, one of those types of houses. She did not want her son to work in the mills, and she did not want to live in the mill housing, because she knew that she would be tied down, never make any money, always be paying off what the mill people were trying to get from her. And she had a huge grievance against the mills, which I'll go over in a minute. She's working in New Bedford in 1898. Now, in 1898, New Bedford has a major strike. And because of circumstances, the 1898 strike in New Bedford became national news. And it became national news for this reason. The battle between labor and capital, as they call it, or the mill owners in this case, had been raging for a long time. And there were two major strikes where there was violence, not in textile mills, but there was violence, and the National Guard got involved. And that was the Homestead Steel Strike in 1892 and the Pullman car strike in 1894. There was all kinds of action and violence, and people got killed and so forth. It was national news, and those were symbols of the battle between labor and capital. Well, at the very beginning of the 1898 strike, there was violence at one of the mills in New Bedford. Some of the strikers threw rocks through one of the mills, the Bristol Mill in the North End, and it looked like there was going to be the same kind of activity going on here as that was in the other strikes. So the national press identified New Bedford as a hotspot for their news. Now, William Randolph Hearst in particular, and others in the national press sent their best reporters here. The most important labor leaders of the time came to New Bedford, like Eugene V. Debs, Samuel Gompers, all the big names in the labor movement. The major socialists of the time came to New Bedford because they saw this was going to be the next big thing. There was never any violence after the initial breaking of windows with rocks at the Bristol Mill, but nonetheless, they all came here. And a lot of the journalists that came, there were a lot of female journalists actually that came too, and basically they were told not just to report the news, but to try to make the news. What does that sound like, And so there was a tremendous amount of activity here. And Harriet Pickering had a tremendous grievance against the mills, which was totally unfair. And that was, she was a weaver. She wove a job, handed it off to the overseer, and then a little later on she'd find out that there was a mar in it. They would just deduct her pay. And that burned her so bad because she knew that there were so many things that could go wrong between the time she even got the thread and the time that she wove the cloth, that it wasn't only her fault, but she was the one who was paying the price for it. And it was really punitive, unnecessarily punitive. She hated it. And so when they started to rally, the workers, when the strike began, Harriet got up and was speaking eloquently about the need to unite as groups, because all the different trades were one group and the nationalities were another. They just couldn't go. It wasn't just one union. It was like 10 different unions. So she was trying to get everybody to unite and be one union, and also this system of deducting your pay was called fining, F-I-N-I-N-G, fining. And she wanted to get rid of that. And so she talked eloquently about this, and the national press noticed it right away. And all of a sudden she was national news. Harriet Pickering. They called her the Joan of Ark of New Bedford. Well, it was fun for a while because she was getting a lot of attention and she thought she was going to get someplace with her issues. But after a while, the strike was going nowhere. Even the other women were not interested in her issues. They were interested in their own issues, which was basically to have a job, not lose a job. They even had something in those days called the family wage, because not only were the parents working in the mills, but the kids were working in the mills too. So they were making enough money to live. And then that was all working against Harriet, and all of a sudden, at the start she was rallying people and she was, speaking before groups and so forth, and then it became just the opposite. People didn't want anything to do with her, and she was just, unfortunately for her, she was ahead of her time. she had gone 50 years later, maybe she might have made some progress, but she just could not make any headway, unfortunately. The strike ended because nothing was going. One of the reasons the strike ended. There were two particular reasons why the strike ended. They called the strike in January, which is a bad thing to do because food is more expensive. Coal, they had to heat. You have to heat your house with stuff. So it was a bad time because it's an expensive time of year to live. That was working against it. People were reluctant to stay on strike, and the battleship Maine blew up in Havana Harbor in February of 1998. So all of a sudden, the national press had something else to write about. And actually, William Randolph Hearst, he was one of the main urges of the national government to go to war with Spain over this particular issue. It was just a mess, and she ended up really not making any progress. She was very discouraged. She even thought about leaving, and she probably got blacklisted because she had been so vocal against the mill owners. But because she was a weaver, she was a very skilled weaver. She was a really good weaver. She got other jobs, but when she started to get fined again, she decided to leave. I think she decided to leave New Bedford as well as the industry. She had told one of the reporters that she was thinking about going into being a bookkeeper someplace because she just couldn't stand it any longer. When she got the new job at one of the mills, the minute she got fined again, she just walked out and disappeared. I don't know what happened to Harriet. The last time she was in the directory was 1900. She was living in this house here in 1900. And I don't know what happened to her. I think she probably packed up and left New Bedford, maybe got a job in something else, doing the bookkeeping that she thought she might be doing, took her son and went someplace else. I think that's probably what happened. I mean, she could have stayed and got married. She could have moved back to England, which was kind of pretty common. But I think she probably stayed here in the United States, just moved someplace else and got a job and just sort of disappeared from history. But for a brief time, she was a very compelling character. Took a lot of chances. She even spoke before the state legislature on these issues. There was a wage council going on at the same time. She went to Boston. She was interviewed and spoke before the committees and so forth. Always, talking about mostly the fining part. That was her issue, and it sort of didn't work for her in the end. But nonetheless, a very interesting lady, and I always wondered what happened to her. The guy whose name's on the plaque, his name was Thomas Eckfeldt, and he was recruited by the French Academy to be their principal. And in 1880, he had the house built, I guess. It was built for him, I think, or at least maybe it was built and he purchased it. But he's listed as the first owner of the house, Eckfeldt. I had a feeling when I saw the name, I said, Eckfeldt, boy, where did that name come from? Because that's not a local name at all, But anyway, he was from Philadelphia, and he got the job at the Friends Academy as a principal. By the time he got the job in the 1880s through the middle 1890s, the Friends Academy was not a Quaker school anymore. It was secular. I mean, they were accepting everybody. It was just a nice private elementary school, 1 through 8 grades, like it is today. The house itself is a very interesting house. 1880. It's in the Colonial Revival style. Now, what's interesting to me about this house is the fact that the gambrel roof. The South Coast is known for colonial buildings for the gambrel roof Cape style house, one and a half story house with a gambrel roof. That's the unique part of the South Coast colonial architecture. When the Colonial Revival was being developed after the Centennial in Philadelphia in 1876, there was a house at that Centennial built inside one of the exhibit halls. It inspired architects to look at the past. And so they did. They went to places like the South Coast and New England and Virginia where there were big collections of colonial homes to get inspiration. What did the houses look like? And the houses that were particularly interesting to them because of the variety and numbers of them was the gambrel roof. Now, they're not as many as there used to be because even when the pictures were taken in the early 1900s and even before, the old pictures of these houses, a lot of them have been destroyed for one reason or another. They've been developed, the land has been developed and so forth. And one of the more beautiful homes, actually, used to be, is now the site of the Acushnet Cemetery. So those are the types of things that happens. So anyway, this house is a nice advantage, uses that feature. Now, the difference between the colonial houses and colonial revival houses is that the colonial revival houses are huge. There was no three-story houses in New Bedford with gambrel, in the South Coast or anywhere else for that matter, with a gambrel roof in the colonial era. That just wouldn't have happened. It was too big. They didn't have that kind of money, they didn't have kind of skill to build a house this big. So that's what they did. They basically put 2 floors underneath to design a house that looks pretty much like they used to, but not really. It's a beautiful example of colonial revival architecture. Sort of. It's still got its shingles, thank goodness. This would have usually the gambrels were shingle styles. There's some beauties throughout the South Coast, particularly there's a couple in Swansea that are really, really old that still survive. But other towns too have nice examples of them still, and that's unique to our area and something that we hopefully will be able to preserve. These 2 houses, especially this one, but this one as well, they're identical actually, pretty much identical, except for the detailing on the porch. And they were designed by a New Bedford architect by the name of Louis E. Destremps, Destremps. He was French-Canadian. Destremps' father was named Louis G. Destremps, and he was, if you're familiar with Fall River, he designed the Notre Dame Church, and a very famous church in Bedford. But Louis E. Destremps, he was sent to New Bedford by his father to salvage St. Anthony's Church when it was being built. St. Anthony's Church in the North End, really one of the great built structures in the city, without doubt. Spectacular building. If you haven't been in St. Anthony's, it's worth making a trip. It's worth going to church to see the inside of that spectacular building. And it was designed by a French Canadian from Montreal. His name is Venn, V-E-N-N-E. But early in the construction, this is around 1904, 1906, early in the construction of St. Anthony's, a wall fell down, killed 5 people, construction people. And of course, everybody was pointing fingers on what it was, but there was a lot of feeling that the architect made a structural error in his design. So they didn't want to bring him back. So they brought Louis E. Destremps in to save the day. And did he ever? Now, he doesn't get credit for designing St. Anthony's, but he gets a big asterisk because he's responsible for, if you've been in St. Anthony's, he's responsible for all the figures, the sculptors that did all the figures on there's 32 those huge figures in St. Anthony's, 32 of them. He was responsible. He knew the sculptor. He brought him in to do that job. He did a lot of the other design in the inside of that job, did a fabulous job. And because of that, because of his work at St. Anthony's, he decided to move here and designed all sorts of buildings. Louis Destremps did the Star Store, the Orpheum, the Car Barn, Betsy B. Winslow School, these 2 houses. There's a house on 286 Hawthorne, beautiful house. A lot of his houses, if they're original, were made with stucco. He did use stucco a lot. It's funny, his own house on Mount Pleasant, 124 Mount Pleasant Street, it looks identical to these 2, except his entryway is a lot similar. Unfortunately, his own house is vinyl sided. So it was probably stuccoed at one point, but now it's vinyl sided. So anyway, he was a very important guy. Didn't live a long life, unfortunately. He died of pneumonia in 1919. He was only 43 years old. But his legacy his building legacy in New Bedford is extraordinary because some of the real iconic buildings in the city he did. St. Joseph Church in the North End, if you're familiar with the North End of New Bedford, St. Joseph's, he designed that. Did a couple of the other churches as well. A lot of his buildings, like a lot of things, a lot of his buildings have come down. The old police station, people remember the old police station is where the Santander building is now, downtown. That was his as well. So he was an interesting, very, very talented guy, and lucky that we had him. So this house here was the home of Frank Nield, N-E-I-L-D, Frank Nield. And the Nields were mill owners, but they were unusual mill owners. Frank's father, John, was one of the few men that rose from operative or machine operator on the floor to mill owner. You can follow his career through the directories. He was a weaver, and then he was an overseer, and then he was a superintendent of one of the Wamsutta mills, and then he was an agent for one of the mills, the Grinnell mill. Agent was a very, very important job. The agent was the guy who farmed out jobs, got jobs, made sure the stuff was, the woven and spun goods were sold, so that the mill could make money. So the agent was a very, very important job. He was an agent of the Grinnell mill, and then he decided to build his own mill, the Nield mill. And the Nield mill is in the North End, not too far from, it's just a block or so north of Nash Road. It's not a very big mill. The big giant Belleville warehouse is nearby, but the Nield mill still stands. It's not in very good condition, but all the components of the Nield mill are still there. I think it was Tom McCann. Somebody said it was Tom McCann, maybe at one. I don't know. I shouldn't say. I don't remember. Anyway, it was a nice little mill. John Nield even formed his own bank for a while. He had his own bank downtown called the Textile Trust, so he was doing pretty well. But the Great Depression wasn't kind to a lot of mills, and Nield Mill was one of them. They just couldn't get jobs. There was something called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation during the Great Depression that was like a granting organization to try to save what the organization thought might be viable businesses, the RFC, Reconstruction Finance Corp. And the Nield Mill applied for and got a grant, but it still did not, even with the money, you still needed work, and there wasn't any work. They even tried to, when that failed, they even tried to save the mill by, they concocted a scheme where the mill workers would have a share in the ownership of the mill. That was revolutionary, to say the least. They had the mill workers on board and stuff, but again, it didn't fly because they couldn't get any jobs. They couldn't get any work. And so the mill failed finally. But they tried their best. They tried every avenue they could to try to keep the mill afloat. But in the Great Depression, if there was nobody buying anything, there was no work, there was nothing you could do about it. And the Nield Mill failed in 1836 or 7. I forget which day it is exactly. Now that didn't mean that the Nield Mill stayed unoccupied though. One of the other mills that was right on the Acushnet River in the North End was called the Soule Mill, S-O-U-L-E, the Soule Mill. And it was situated right on the Acushnet River, like a little promontory actually, at the foot of Sawyer Street, if you're familiar with the city. And the 38 hurricane did big time damage to the Soule Mill because of the storm surge. And so while they were trying to fix the mill after the storm, it caught on fire. So they had a double whammy, and they decided that they would just give up on that site and move their operation, because it was about the same size, to the Nield Mill. So the Soule Mill ended up buying the Nield Mill and occupied that site until it went out of business in the 1950s. But anyway, Frank was the president of the mill during the Great Depression. He's the one who tried put all the stops, trying to get the mill to succeed, but it failed anyway. And but he did live in this house until he passed away in 1968. Very appreciative you come tonight. I hope you had a good time, and hopefully see you again on another tour. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
What's happening?
Hey, what a nice car you got here, though.
Oh, thank you.
We'll put you on the video.